So I think mistakenly, and I'd love to hear your opinions on this. It's, I think people think, okay, that's HR's responsibility. And, HR is just a very small piece of a large organization. Where do you think the responsibility for DEI belongs, and especially for those that don't have that function? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that it's in the past, it's been kind of a compliance thing. Like we have to follow the rules that the government has laid out for us. And so it fell on HR a lot, but we all know now, hopefully, that DEI is so much more than that. In the last year, since the murder of George Floyd, I think a lot of organizations were kind of thrust into this and they had not been having conversations about it. And so oftentimes it was the HR person who so often is a woman. So it's kind of easy to say, oh, we'll have the woman lead our DEI efforts, or some other person of color in an organization. And that is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. In some ways, it's everyone's responsibility, because if we're going to actually challenge these practices and norms and values, everyone has to be on board with it. But at the same time, when something is everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility. And too often we see that projects, no matter what they're about, don't actually execute well because no one's ultimately responsible. So to me, the person most responsible is the chief executive, and they have to be willing to hold people accountable. And I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, that DEI is one of the few places where you can fail to deliver business results on an ongoing basis, and there are never consequences to it. And so we see organizations who've been trying to reach some goal for years, and no one's ever held accountable, or the person who's held accountable is some DEI person who was never empowered to actually do their job. So the chief executive has to be the person that's ultimately responsible for DEI, even though it's everyone's responsibility for carrying it out in an organization.
Great answer. Ginnette, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Erin said there. One of the things that I think is really perhaps making this a more important conversation than ever, in terms of, we all own and we all kind of care about this on a human level, is looking at the impact that it's having around hiring and retention. So when you start to look at the stats now, it's so important to employees to work in a company that feels like it's authentic around its diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And I think the last stat I saw was between 50 and 60% of people said that it was a defining reason for whether they joined an organization or whether they stayed within an organization. And so because so many of us are unwilling to kind of look the other way, and to Erin's point, work in organizations that make really bold statements but then don't kind of follow through with that, and it is actually impacting the ability to kind of attract and retain the right talent. Right. It's finally, I think, producing that level of kind of accountability where it should sit, which is in the C-suite and with kind of the senior leadership team.
Appreciate it. Great feedback. What approaches do you think organizations should take to make sure that the company is aligned with their DEI efforts?
So there needs to be, so to achieve true inclusion within an organization, there has to actually be alignment on 3 different levels. So one is organizational inclusion, the other is work group inclusion, and then line manager inclusion. So when you're talking about organizational inclusion, you're looking there for what policies are in place, Does the organization create and actively support employee resource groups? Is there a clear mission statement around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And is that, do the company's values really underpin those same kind of principles? Is there that golden thread? What training is in place? Does the organization create space and forums for these conversations to be happening? You know, are there mentoring and sponsorship programs for underrepresented groups? So there's all of these different things, and I think there's probably Erin can no doubt add a ton more things, but at an organizational level, like those are the things that you're kind of looking for. But then the work group inclusion, that's your sort of day-to-day experience, and is really the sort of norms within which the team operates. And so you can actually, sometimes you'll see the differences when people ask, how is it to work at this company? Well, it's great if you work on the engineering team, but you don't want to work on the marketing team, right? Like it's these kind of sort of differences, which are, you know, are there fair employment reviews? Are people valued for being themselves? Do you get the opportunity to contribute you input? Is there a safe way to report grievances? And so again, this is really the sort of definition of how you know, at a team or departmental level that you're really kind of operating. And then the other area is actually line manager sort of driven. I personally think this is one of the most overlooked areas. So, you know, companies will feel that, you know, we got these great team dynamics, we got all the things at an organizational level. Well, actually, my experience is going to be so shaped and so defined by my day-to-day interaction with my line manager. And here is where you see such a big difference between whether line managers authentically kind of buy into this, and number two, that actual skill set around being able to manage, you know, and kind of lead in a really inclusive way. There's tons of surveys. I mean, the Gallup survey being probably one of the most well known about people leaving managers, and I think as relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is a huge one. It's still the sort of biggest culprit. When I launched Harper & Gray, it was one of the reasons that I knew that I absolutely needed to have a support in service line that developed managers through executive coaching in this area, because if you've been used to leading teams that look like you and think like you, and then all of a sudden there's all these diversity initiatives, but there isn't necessarily that kind of support, I think we really do need to kind of meet managers where they are, and it needs to be a priority for organizations, because for them to be aligned, you're looking at you know, how well they are role modeling, you know, failure and approach to sort of risk, and how well they sort of, do they value good decisions over being right? Do they help their team to kind of lean into discomfort? Are they fair, transparent? Like all of these different things that, you know, sort of go into the impressions that employees are kind of left with. So I would say it's kind of the combination of those three things. If one of them's misaligned, then I think it's very, you'll see that come out in engagement surveys and kind of feedback, and you won't hit the mark.
Yeah. And I think, so taking a step back for us, because we have such a global brand, right? This really big brand. Our employees are always looking to see how do our internal efforts align with what is happening externally. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And for us, it was setting up a framework, and we have 4 pillars, and I can talk about them a little bit. But I think the idea of having a framework that crosses different areas of the organization and how you approach DEI efforts is critical. So we call them our 4 pillars, feet, tongue, heart, and wallet. So feet is all about how we show up in the community, our community relations efforts, our volunteer efforts amongst employees, how we partner with our partners, like, Chase Center is named after, in showing up to have programming for different areas of the community, and also how we align with government entities and community organizations. So this year, for the first time, we supported legislation, which is not something we've done in the past. That falls under the FEET framework. And then we have tongue, which is how we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our social channels and marketing and in PR efforts, but not just how we talk about it. It's looking at what voices we choose to amplify, because so much is about how you use your platform to amplify others. And then we have heart, which is a lot about what Ginnette talked about. It's all the internal stuff, and that is sort of run by HR. So our reviews and our hiring and our training and development, and tracking different goals and metrics throughout the organization, all of our pulse surveys. And then last is wallet, and that shows up in 3 ways. We have our Warriors Community Foundation, which is how we donate money. And we're looking at those organizations that we're donating to and making sure they're doing the type of work that we want to see, and they represent the population that we want to support. But it's also about how we have diverse suppliers and who we're spending our money with, and building that network, and really looking at our procurement function, and also how we partner with people. So we've audited all of our partners, which is a really large source of revenue for us, and making sure that they are aligned with us on DEI efforts. So it has to be bigger than just what you're doing internally, which is absolutely critical. And that's what I work on most of the time. But it's also about making sure that what you're doing externally and in other parts of your organization are aligning with that as well. So that group that works on the 4 pillars, we meet regularly. We're reporting out to the organization to hold ourselves accountable. We've talked about it externally, so that we're also holding ourselves accountable to our fans and our community and all of those stakeholders. So I think that that's a huge part of alignment, is looking beyond just those internal practices, and also looking at how you're interacting with your community, with your clients and customers, and all of those different stakeholders.